Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I will not try to be insulted by the fact that we have a larger crowd than we usually do at our symphony previews. And of course, usually Cindy's the one doing these introductions for me, but today I get to make the introduction. We have with us not only one of the greatest banjoists of all time, but one of the most creative and curious musicians of our day as well. Can you welcome Bela Fleck, please? And I think we'll sort of take questions throughout as they come up, but we'll start with just a bit about your origin story.
Okay. Hi, how's everybody? Thanks for coming.
Go ahead. That was okay.
I was born in New York City and lived on the Upper West Side of New York City. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, maybe somewhere in there, I heard the banjo on the Beverly Hillbillies television show at my grandparents' house out in Queens, and it blew my mind. For some reason, it just I had nothing to do with. We didn't have folk music. We weren't musical or anything at the time in our family, but something about that sound just struck me, and it was the banjo. In particular, that was Earl Scruggs' banjo. And Earl Scruggs has this, everybody knows who Earl Scruggs is. He's the guy who started this three-finger rippling style that we think of as bluegrass banjo. And if you're going to be a banjo player, a bluegrass banjo player, I call it like an unactivated banjo player, you don't know it yet. When you hear Earl Scruggs, that's the key, that's what turns you on. And I've talked to so many great banjo players who had that moment, that come to Jesus moment, come to Earl moment, where it just happened and everything changed the moment they heard Earl Scruggs' banjo. Now there's a lot of great banjo players out there, they don't all have, including, I'm not going to say myself, but that have this impact on people. Earl Scruggs is the only guy I can think of who just activates banjo players that aren't going to be activated in massive numbers. It's wild. And so this guy is just such a great musician. He just sort of transcended the instrument and brought it into, actually out of obscurity. It was kind of going down. It was starting to disappear a little bit. That's not I left the Bela story here, because the Earl Scruggs story is a lot more interesting. But at any rate, it wasn't until I was 15 that I got a banjo, and that was just by fluke. I hadn't really told anybody about this banjo obsession because I don't know, it wasn't popular up there in New York City, and it was a little odd, and also I didn't think I would ever be able to play it. It sounded impossible that anybody could actually play a banjo from what you were hearing. Just so fast and so complex, and also so earthy and deep. I played a little bit of guitar, sort of half-assed guitar. I was one of those kids who was sort of interested in music, but I wasn't like on fire. But then when I was 15, my grandfather got this banjo at a garage sale, $35 or something like that, and he said, "I know you play guitar, so maybe you'd like this." And that was the moment for me when all of a sudden the world changed, and I found this passion for that instrument. So when you got a kid who isn't turned on to an instrument, and you think, oh, he's not musical, a lot of times it's not the right instrument. So, but for me, that was the key. So once I got the banjo, that's all I did was play banjo. I was in high school at a place that we call it the Fame School because they had that television show, I'm Gonna Live Forever, and I got into it just on musical aptitude. You took a test and they grade you on like whether you can repeat back rhythms or sing back notes, and I could do all that stuff. So they said, okay, we'll take you and we'll teach you an orchestral instrument or put you in the chorus or something like that. And so I went in, I was 15, I had just gotten my banjo literally the day before high school started, and they weren't going to have that banjo, they weren't going to have anything to do with that. It was way too early anyway, but for me. So they tried to put me on French horn, which was just a disaster. So every once in a while I see in a bio or something that says Bela Fleck, a French horn player. So I could never get the first F. But I was around a lot of classical music. My stepfather was a cellist who was in the army, in 7th Symphony, and so he played a lot of string quartet music. He was head of guidance for the Brooklyn school systems. And my mother was an elementary school teacher. So anyway, he would play string quartets and stuff like that every couple of weeks. That people would come over and play that music in the living room at our house. So that was a great thing to hear. At the same time as I was learning to play the banjo, I was also hearing a lot of great classical music, and also in school. And then in New York, there was just so much great music going on. This was the early 70s. So the jazz world was exploding with sort of the modern fusion sounds of Miles Davis's more modern music, Chick Corea and Return to Forever, John McLaughlin, Mahavishnu. Jazz was undergoing this very exciting change, moving into the modern world, into a new phase of jazz. So I was hearing all that stuff while I was learning to play the banjo, and I wasn't all that into the bluegrass thing. I was like into country music or like singing with an accent. The songs kind of drove me crazy a little bit at first. And in fact, the singing, I made a mistake of saying this on NPR once. Somebody asked me about it. And I said, well, for a New York kid, hearing Bill Monroe sing was kind of like hearing cats being slaughtered. I regret that, saying that, but I'll own it. But as time went on, it was like I always sort of describe it as being like coffee. Like when you're a kid and your parents are drinking coffee, you go, oh, I'm going to try that, and you go, oh, this is terrible. Why would anybody drink this? But as life goes on, it gets better and better to you until, at some point you're a coffee fanatic. You think it's one of the coolest tastes. And I think bluegrass singing was like that for me. It just took a little, I had to get over the alienness of it, being a New York kid. I had nothing to do with that kind of a thing. And even folk music in the Northeast was not like folks from the Deep South singing. So, at any rate, then by the end of high school, I was very fortunate in that my mother and my stepfather had a mistake and had an unexpected child, and they weren't paying any attention to me. So I managed to get out of, I didn't apply to any colleges because I wanted to play the banjo, and they didn't notice. And because they had a newborn baby in the house. And just think about this, the head of guidance for the Brooklyn school systems and an elementary school teacher, and their kid doesn't apply to any schools at all, and they don't even notice. So they're very educationally minded. So that was kind of wild. So there I was. By the time they realized that I hadn't applied to anything, they were just like in shock. And I said, I guess you're going to have a year off. And I said, okay, I think I know what to do. And pretty soon I had a job in a bluegrass band up in Boston, and I just started hitting the road and playing and learning the music from people. And I started out playing in these sort of modern Yankee bluegrass bands that tended to do things less traditionally because they didn't come from the South. But after a few years in Boston playing in this band, unfortunately named Tasty Licks, after doing that for, I guess, 3 or 4 years, and eventually that band fell apart, and I made a living playing on the street in Boston, in Harvard Square for a summer. I moved to Kentucky. And part of why I wanted to do that is because I felt like I was a Yankee banjo player. I played all the sort of newfangled stuff, but I wasn't that good at bluegrass, and I didn't even have the full respect for it that I needed to have. And so anyway, I moved down to Lexington to be in a band with some guys who had played with a great banjo player named J.D. Crowe. And J.D. was like, after Earl Scruggs, one of the most powerful, strong, old-fashioned banjo players that's ever come along. Just a fantastic player. And I wanted to be in that orbit, because when I was around people that were good at something, my respect for it would grow so much. When I was around traditional players that were amazing, well, then I started to really see what was so great about traditional music. And I wanted to be able to do it. I didn't want to be, oh, he's a good Yankee player, he can play that northern stuff, but he can't really play the real stuff. So I spent a few years in Kentucky, and while I was in this band, I would always go hear J.D. Crowe play at the Holiday Inn, which had a place called the Post Lounge, where they would play bluegrass every night and bring in the top bands from around the country. They would stay for 3 weeks, and I'd just go park myself there and watch J.D. Crowe play every night, that I wasn't away touring, playing music. And all these other great people that came through, too. And I also studied a lot of these Earl Scruggs live radio shows, because by this time I knew every Earl Scruggs record probably that was out there. I'd heard it all, but I didn't realize what an improviser he was. And it was when you listen to these live radio shows, often taped at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, these guys would get in a car, go play a radio show, get in a car, drive to another part of the country, play again, and go all week. They would travel until they got home to Nashville, and they'd play the Grand Ole Opry on the weekend. And I didn't realize how differently he played every day. And he was a really very, very spontaneous musician, and he also always had this incredible singing, this tone that would just hook you, and this rhythmic propulsion that we call drive. In bluegrass we call it drive, where the music seems like it's speeding up, but in the best possible case it actually isn't. It just feels like it is. It's not actually getting faster. But sometimes it is getting a little faster. But the perfect idea of drive in bluegrass would be that it would maintain this forward propulsion without actually speeding up out of control. It would stay pretty much clicking along at a consistent pace. So there's a babble for you.
Are there sort of direct mentors that you had that were really influential?
Yeah, I started out with a folk banjo player named Eric Darling, who was in a band called the Weavers, and he had joined the band after a guy named Pete Seeger had left. And he was very, very idealistic, and he started with the Weavers with the guys, but when they decided they wanted to do a commercial, someone asked him to play music for a commercial, and they all wanted to do it, but him, he quit the band. That's not why he was doing the music, just didn't, that's just what kind of guy he was. And so anyway, this is the guy who took his place, Eric Darling. And so he taught folk banjo, and he taught me for, I don't know, maybe for less than a year. And at a certain point, he passed me on to another guy who knew all the bluegrass styles. And there's a bunch of different techniques that you use in bluegrass, from the Scruggs style to the melodic style and to the single string style, which are all sort of separate worlds. And usually people are good at one or two of those. And then he sent me to this guy named Tony Trishka, and Tony was sort of the reigning modernist of the banjo, and still is one of the great forward thinkers on the banjo that was doing a lot of new music, a lot of very personal music, influenced by his experience growing up in the 60s. So it was in odd meters, it had atonality in it, very experimental and also very primitive and powerful. And so he became my hero, and I started trying to play like him. I took some lessons from him. And then after that, I was on my own.
Any questions about this? Yeah.
You and Allison Brown changed the way I think about the banjo. You're going to play with the symphony orchestra this weekend. What are the challenges of bringing this instrument to this context and playing with a full orchestra on stage?
Yeah, Allison's a great banjo player. She came along around the same time as Stuart Duncan. They're both from San Diego, and they came in after I'd been at it for a while. And she's also a Tony Trishka fan, big lover of his music and all the modern stuff on the banjo too. She started her own record company, and she's been making cool music the whole time. So the trick with the symphony is, someone described it to me, so like I play in my own group, it's called Veil of Fleck and the Flecktones, and it's only 4 guys. And a bluegrass band is 6 guys at the most, unless in some unusual situation you have double fiddles or something, which happens once in a while. It's a small group. It's almost like a string quartet or a quintet or sextet, in that the musicians can hear each other quite well. And so when I first played with the symphony, one of the percussionists said, well, you're used to driving Ferrari, and now you're going to be on an aircraft carrier. It does not turn fast. Right? So that's the thing about small group music. It can be very tight, very people can hear each other very well and adjust and find their place rhythmically and pitch-wise within that group. But in a big group, you really need a referee because suppose you're over there, you folks, and you guys are over there, and you're supposed to play together, and you're that far away or further, and not only that, there's a lot of noise going on during a lot of sound in between you guys happening. The only way you can do it, and this guy described it to me, is you have to go by the speed of light rather than the speed of sound, which is too slow. But with the baton, you can see that's the speed of light. And you can count on that, and you have to trust this guy. He's hearing it all, and he's hearing how it's all mixing. And so at any rate, that was the tricky thing. I'm used to playing very rhythmically tight, concise kind of music. And so when playing with the symphony, it was tricky to figure out how to do that. And really, that's not what the symphony's going to do best, is play the supermetric, very detailed music that I was used to doing. So I had to try to compose something that would suit that. And I've done 3 pieces like that now. And this was the second one that we're going to do start rehearsing tomorrow. And I think I had learned some things from the first piece about things that were ill-advised, that weren't necessarily bad music, but they weren't practical. They weren't super practical because what happens is when you have an orchestra performance, you have very limited rehearsal time. Usually you get like an hour or an hour and a half the day before, and then on the day of the show you get a dress rehearsal, and that's it for a lot of these things. So if you have a passage that takes 20 minutes to get right at rehearsal, then you don't get to spend the time learning the whole rest of the piece. So that's really the writer's fault, not the orchestra's fault or the conductor's fault. So I realized after the first piece that I should just try to write the best piece I could that didn't have too much that was, really took a lot of practice time. And so I think, great composers that really know the orchestra, they intuitively know that stuff because they've been around that their whole lives. I haven't. I'm a poser. I'm coming in from outside. I'm interested. I'm excited, but I don't have that lifetime of knowledge. So that's the kind of piece you're going to hear, is a piece written by somebody from outside of that world who's had a lot of musical influences and experiences outside of that world, trying to bring those into a strange, known world. But I think this one works better than the first one, although I like them both musically. This one works a lot better for the orchestra.
Thank you.
What influenced you to start writing for symphony and getting involved?
Yeah, what influenced me? So remember I said when I first heard some of these great traditional players, all of a sudden my excitement about traditional music improved because I could see it right there with the person right next to me being incredible. And so I really didn't have, my stepfather was not a great cellist. He was a good cellist and he could play a symphony, but he wasn't at a very high level. And the music I was hearing in the house, the string quartets, was not like this primo, like what the highest level of that music is. But at a certain point in the early 80s, I met a guy who was at that level, who became a very good friend of mine as a peer. And I could see him doing it, and I could see him interacting with the top people in the field, and all of a sudden I got it, like what was so great about classical music, even though it had been in my life all the time, but almost as background music. So this is a guy named Edgar Meyer, and Edgar is one of the great bassists in classical music and outside. And he's such a good bass player. He's so able with the bow. He can play cello suites and violin music. He plays all the way up at the top of the fingerboard, and he just sounds so fluid and beautiful. And but he has a problem that since there haven't been bass players like him before, there isn't great music for him to play with, that's written already. There's like one bass concerto that he likes by Bottesini, but aside from that, most of the stuff that they'll write for a bass player is just quite simple. And so he's always was forced to go outside of the bass repertoire to find really good music that was as good as his technique. So he started writing his own and building music around his abilities and his thinking. And he also did a lot of recitals. I first saw him do recitals where he would play Bach and all kinds of classical stuff, just with piano support. And so he was also kind of an alien, even as inside of the classical world as he was doing things and trying to find ways to make his instrument fit in ways it hadn't fit before. And then he became a best friend of mine and a mentor and a peer. And I watched him write his first concertos, and I thought, well, someday I should try to do that too. So that was the key. Seeing somebody actually doing it made me really understand how great it could be. Yeah.
So are your parents glad you didn't go to college?
My mother's 82. I think it was maybe just like last year that she stopped asking me if I didn't want to go to college. Yeah, there was a long time when she would always ask me, "Don't you think, honey? Don't you think?" I'd say, I don't know. I think we'll be okay. The truth is, there aren't too many banjo players who get to make a good living and have a successful career doing the music they want to do. So, I think it was a pretty reasonable thing for her to ask, but it was also correct for me to follow my instincts and stick to what I was doing. Just dumb luck, it turned out that I could actually pull off a career, get a career off the ground playing the banjo, which is, again, it's very, very rare. You don't see any other banjo players playing the symphonies, doing their concertos. So you see it and I'm playing with musicians, like Edgar or Chick Corea or the kinds of musicians like that to interact with. So it's a very rare situation. And so she was right. I just transcended that for some reason. We go on? Yeah.
Well, so once
I feel funny and Mike, did you not? Well, you got a big voice.
I'll project. Okay. So you talked about how you went to Kentucky to learn some traditional stuff. So at what point did you really start branching out past that?
Right. So all along, I was trying all kinds of stuff. Even in high school, I learned one of the Bach partitas or a little segment of one, and I was learning all kinds of jazz stuff. After hearing Chick Corea play with this band, I had a revelation that all the notes that they were playing on their instruments in this incredible jazz group were on my banjo. I just didn't know where they were. I had to figure out where they were. And so I had been trying to figure that out, kind of a closet jazz aficionado, and I had a real book. You know what a real book is? You probably do not. Well, it's a book full of all of the chords and the melodies of all the top jazz tunes. And so I had that book, and I was trying to figure out, like, what is a G major seventh with a flat? What's a G minor with a major seventh? What's a half diminished chord? And then how do they go up and down the neck? And learning the voicings and all the what do you call them? When you move out the chord.
Changes or modulation?
Inversions, thank you. All the inversions of all the chords up and down the neck, and then all the scales up and down the neck, and trying to figure out, because people weren't playing the banjo that way. And so in order to interface in that world, I figured I needed the basics that you would have learned on any other instrument. I always say on a real instrument, if you played a real instrument, you would have learned to play scales and to learn your way around the instrument. But on a folk instrument like the banjo, you learn positions and you learn songs, you learn tunes, and the tunes teach you things about the instrument, and you learn fill tunes, for instance, teach you a lot about the different positions, but only usually in major keys. So what happened if banjo's tuned in G, what if I'm in F sharp minor? Now how am I going to, what how was going to happen? So I was working on all that stuff, and even in Lexington I was getting together with local jazz musicians that would have me and playing through the jazz standards and trying to just get better at it. And then I joined a band in Nashville called Newgrass Revival, and it was kind of a rock, bluegrass, very expansive, creative, wonderful band that I was with for 9.5 years. And when I moved to Nashville, I continued my sort of closet jazz studies. But again, the folk process, the same way I've learned to write for orchestras is the way I learned to play jazz. I don't consider myself a legit jazz player because I didn't learn all the things that you learn when you're taught jazz, because there was no way to teach that to banjo. I just sort of picked it up from transcribing things I liked. And so I had a lot of gaps in my knowledge, but I also had maybe a more unique approach that was, based on not learning all the same things everyone else learned about chord substitutions or the way to run 2/5s or all the things that you think about as a jazz musician. I didn't really understand any of that. I had a sort of a folk knowledge of jazz. And it worked in that my music had its own sound. And also the fact that it was generated from the banjo, that I was writing these tunes on the banjo, not a guitar, saxophone, or piano, meant that when I taught it to other musicians, it was a little different. So after 9 years in Newgrass Revival, I had started to meet all the guys in that later became part of the Flecktones. And I don't know how many of you guys know about the Flecktones. Some. It's a band that shouldn't have worked. We shouldn't have been able to make it go. All it was banjo, harmonica, electric bass, and an electronic drum guitar. So this was just a crazy thing I was going to try for this one half-hour set on a television show that was showing my music, because I was well known in the bluegrass world at that time. And this thing was, the musicians were so kind of crazy and wonderful. Everybody just thought this thing was great. And I like way more than we ever. It was for me. It was just a crazy idea. It's a go ahead and put together a jazz group. Well, how about if I put together a group of wackos like me? And so I found these 4 guys, and we went out and started playing. And pretty soon it became clear that people went for this, and it was much more esoteric than what Bluegrass Revival was doing. And so I thought this was going to be a really long, slow slog, and I probably wouldn't be able to keep these guys, and I would be committing to being a band leader that played esoteric banjo music with whoever I could find. But to my surprise, the thing took off, and we were pretty soon touring 250 days a year, and went on, and we've been together for 30 years, and pretty soon we were on all the major television shows, Johnny Carson, Arsenio Hall, I was on Saturday Night Live, David Letterman, sitting with the bands, and all of a sudden, we were playing much, much bigger places than any of the bluegrass bands that were out there, and sort of were in that sort of, I don't know, the Bobby McFerrin kind of world, and Chick Corea world, and some of the jazz players who were in that world playing these festivals, and we were very successful. So that was very unexpected. That was not what I thought. So I've been able to keep most of the band together. The bass player is a superstar. They all are in their own right. Victor Wooten is one of the great electric bass players of the time, and Future Man's brother, who plays that electronic drum guitar called the drum guitar, is just one of the great percussionists of drummers out there. And Howard Levy is a genius on harmonica and piano. And Howard left for about 20 years and came back, and he's back in the band. We have the original band back together now, and we're still doing that. And I forgot what the question was. Yeah. I used to never be able to talk. I didn't talk for the first 15 years of my career in front of anybody, but then I just had to learn how to, because I was super shy right now. Doesn't seem to be a problem. Yeah.
When you went to Africa, did it take you back to the basics?
When I went to Africa, yeah. So a lot of folks have forgotten that the banjo came from Africa with the slaves, and we think of it as a white Southern instrument, and for good reason, because some of the greatest American music that we've come up with is bluegrass. I think when you compare it to jazz or Cajun music, it stands up quite well against any other. Or you think about it compared to flamenco music or some of the great music from around the world. It's a really great offering. So the only hard thing about it is that a lot of preconceptions have settled in with the success of bluegrass. The idea that it's a white Southern instrument only, and it comes from Africa, and it played a huge role in the beginnings of jazz. It was in Louis Armstrong's band. It was in Jelly Roll Morton's groups. All the bands had banjo in them, and even before that, there was banjo orchestras played classical music. People had banjos in the late 1800s. A lot of women would have a banjo and play it in the parlor for guests, and she wasn't playing African music or folk music. She was playing music of the day, maybe some Stephen Foster, and things like that. So that whole world has kind of got wiped out. I'll take your question in just a second. And part of the problem was that as white folks learned the banjo from the slaves, there became this movement called minstrel music, which was like where white folks would put on blackface and play banjos and sing songs about how great it was on the plantation, which didn't sit well with the black community. And so there was a point, well after jazz had been established, where guitar showed up, and it was heard on a record that all of a sudden everybody in the black community wanted to get rid of the banjo and have a guitar instead, and all of a sudden the banjo players were out of work almost overnight. It was within a period of a year, banjo was excised from jazz basically because of all these connotations, and they were so at that point the banjo was kind of dying out, and that's when Earl Scruggs turned up in 1946, joins Bill Monroe's band, and is on the Grand Ole Opry, which had a huge audience around the country that heard that show, and it was like the Beatles on Ed Sullivan when Bill Monroe came on stage with Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt. That was the big boom that started bluegrass for the world. Because before Earl and Lester joined the Bluegrass Boys, which was Bill Monroe's band from Kentucky, it didn't sound like that. It wasn't this high-tech modern form of folk music that occurred when those guys got together. And all of a sudden, nobody was ready for it when they got on stage at the Opry. It was absolutely bedlam. And there's some recordings of it you can hear. When people first heard the band with this three-finger rippling banjo sound, it was wild. What was your question?
Kind of a technical question, because I was reading up on the banjo, 5, 7, 9 string. So I was wondering, are you playing the traditional 5-string?
I'm playing 5-string, yeah. And I never really finished your question about Africa, but I did go back to Africa because I wanted to sort of shine a light on that, and I also wanted to experience it for myself. So banjo comes from West Africa, and that's where the slaves came from. So Senegal, the Gambia, countries around there. And there's lots of instruments like banjos over there. There still are. And they're gourds with skin heads and strings. And a lot of them have the short string. And that's the thing about the 5-string banjo, is it's more of the African banjo because it has the drone string, the high string on it as well. We'll have to show you. The weird thing about the 5-string banjo and all of these banjos with drones is that the highest string is next to the lowest string, which is great and terrible. So here's my high string up on top, the short one, and then I have the other 4. And here, and I'll show you how it's tuned. So if I start from the top, from the high string, it's tuned to an open G chord. So if I started on the 4th string and hit the 5th string last, it would be a G arpeggio starting on D. But it doesn't start there, it starts here. So we use that 5th string sort of to color in and fill in. We're playing a simple melody. The 5th string is just sort of suspending a G over the top of all of those. What Earl Scruggs did, like before Earl Scruggs, and I'm terrible at this style, by the way, but there's a style called frailing, and my wife is great at it. People did a lot of that. They also did some very simple 2-finger stuff. And what Earl figured out how to do is add in his 3rd finger and start doing this rippling thing where you could go. When you alternate your fingers, no finger has to move very fast. And you can play super fast with very little effort. So using the open strings, watch any finger, it's not really going much faster than that, right? It's just all about, just like piano, but it just changed the whole possibilities for the band. And when I was talking about positions, we talked about like the, Earl called them an X-Y position. There's the open position, and then it all repeats at the 12th fret. From then on, it's the same thing all over again, but higher. People would do all kinds of licks around those positions. Do a lot of shifting. But what I was always curious about is what's in between all those positions, and that's where chromaticism and scales came in. Before I got to the banjo, there was a lot of people doing what we call single string work, which is where you play a scale using your thumb and forefinger alternating, as if it was a flat pick, but instead of going down, up, you go down with your thumb and up with your index. And it sounds like this. And it was very position oriented. There was a couple of guys who had done a lot with that. One was a guy named Don Reno, and another was a guy named Eddie Adcock. And it was built, again, it was built around these positions. Rather than scales, they would learn all these licks around that and here. And so I was looking at all of that and going, well, what's in between? What's in here? And after this Chick Corea show that I saw, where I saw Alvin Miola and Stanley Clark just using every inch of their instrument, knowing their instruments so well, I just started working out the scales, which hadn't really been done with three-finger playing with single string. It was like this. I think I stayed up all night working out the skit, first this kind of thing. All of that stuff, and then thirds. Through all the scales, fourths, etc. I haven't practiced it in a while. It's sixth, seventh, and octave. And by the time I had done a lot of that work, all of a sudden the neck started to look real different to me, and the things that were possible on it. I could just sort of freely move around the neck. All of a sudden the neck just clarified for me as this very fluid. The possibilities were so now I have a lot of techniques that a lot of other people didn't have, and I use them in bluegrass, and I use them in another thing that I learned when I was still in high school was you sound a little better. It's, and it just taught me so many new things about how to get around the neck. It was all, you couldn't do it with any of the positions I was using. You had to learn all these shifting techniques to get around, and it just opened up the world of possibilities. Yeah.
So you had no theory, or did you have theory in high school?
Yeah, I had the basic theory stuff. Yeah, I was. What ended up happening to me in school, at the Fame School, is I ended up being in the chorus. They needed tenors, but I was a baritone. So I just screamed my way through school. And then when I was a senior, they decided to play Rhapsody in Blue for the final concert. And they found a banjo part, this dusty old banjo part they pulled out. There was a huge banjo part in that originally that was in a lot of the versions that's been taken out because they can't find anybody to play it. So by the time I got it, it had been simplified down to like maybe there was 6 notes in the whole score for me to play. And I couldn't tell when to come in, but that was actually my first experience with the orchestra, was trying to play Rhapsody in Blue. And I said, well, where should I go? And they said, we don't know, we've never had a banjo player in the orchestra before, so I sat next to this very cute oboe player, Helen Hay, and that didn't work out. There you go.
So when you were doing the classical album with the Bach and the Debussy, and
Right.
What were the big challenges of putting that together?
So Grant is talking about an album called Perpetual Motion, And that was somewhat inspired by seeing Edgar do these recitals where he would play all kinds of classical pieces that weren't written for the bass in a recital situation. And at a certain point, I had an opportunity to sign with Columbia Sony Records. And it was Peter Gelb, he had Joshua Bell, he had Edgar, he had Yo-Yo Ma, all these guys. And the way the deal worked is they really wanted the Flecktones on the jazz label, and so they offered me an opportunity to do stuff on the classical label and the jazz label and the pop label. And so, and at that time, Branford Marsalis was the head of the jazz department, so it seemed like a pretty great place to be. Of course, by the time we got signed, he had already left, and it was just, record company bozos. But this guy, Peter Gelb, had a conversation with me about what kind of project I might do on the classical label, and he had this idea that I do, a lot of classic stuff on the banjo, and I think if I was a violinist or a pianist or playing any typical classical instrument, I would have found it to be an insulting, like lame thing to do, because I would be wanting to do my own music. But because I never played any of that music on the banjo, and no one had, it seemed like a kind of a high jump. And not only that, it would take so much work to learn it, and then at that point, I would spend years inside that music, and these familiar pieces that I've heard my whole life, that a lot of them are very well-known pieces, I would understand them better, and they would sort of help form the rest of my music. So for a lot of reasons, it seemed like a great thing to do. So, and I was able to record with Joshua Bell and Edgar and Evelyn Glennie, and Chris Thiele played on some stuff on it. And so what was hard about it was, this was before software had come a long way on banjo tablatures. I don't read music very well at all. I'm just a very, very slow reader. And banjo players, we read, banjo notation is numbers. It's a number system. So you see a 2 on luckily it's 5 strings on the banjo, so you can use a music stave, but each line of the 5 staves is a string. So the top one is the first string, and if you see a 2, it's the second fret of the first string. It sounds kind of crazy, but I'll tell you why we do that. Is because, for one thing, we play very fast on the banjo. So within 3 or 4 seconds, you might play 16 notes or more. And the banjo's tuning is such that, for instance, that E on the second string, if I see an E written in musical notation, I go, oh, it's an E. It could be here, it could be here, it could be here, it could be here. It could be in any of these 4 places, and they're a long way apart. Now, if the next note is this, I had better be in this position. But if the next note is this, I better be in this position. So I can't make these sight reading decisions on what position I'm going to be on for every note when I'm going to have like 600 notes, going by in a matter of minutes. So the numbers makes it real easy, because all I have to do is I can look at this number system and I can tell exactly what position I'm in. But it doesn't teach you that much about music, but it does teach you how to get around the banjo and I can sight read that stuff. So, but anyway, the problem back then was, well, let me put it this way. Back then, I wrote these things out, and then I had a whiteout pencil, and I would cross the notes out and change the fingerings, and I would do that over and over again until you couldn't see any of the black lines anymore. It was just the banjo notes, and because you don't want to learn the music until you've got the fingerings pretty well ironed out, because you're going to learn it wrong. So I spent months and months working on these transcriptions, trying to make it work on the banjo and trying all the different possible ways until I settled in on it. Now, nowadays, there's a program called Sibelius, and I can put the notes in, and if I have that E on the first string and I want to move it to another string, I just grab it with the mouse and pull it, and it'll switch to a 5 on the second string, or a 9 on the third string, or a 14 on the fourth string to get that note. And so I can change the tablature very, very quickly, and then hit print, and boom, I've got it. But back then, it took me, most of the time to spend in working out these fingerings and whiting them out, and then eventually I would Xerox it and start over, just keep on working on it. And then we split up the sessions into different time periods, so I only had to work on like 5 of the pieces at one time. And a few months later, we'd work on another 5. Luckily, Edgar was there to help with like for instance, some of them were piano pieces that were split up into 2 hands, like for classical guitar, and like John Williams actually played. It was incredible, my favorite classical guitarist. So in order to do that, you have to lose some of the notes. You have to make it intelligent version of a Chopin Mazurka for banjo and guitar and figure out what notes, if you might not be able to play them all. Anyway. So anyway, Edgar had enough musical wherewithal to make really good choices and help me with the arrangements. In a lot of cases, he was able to be there and help me and say, okay, you can slow down. Just not that pretty fast, you know. Let's have, this section is trying to, you know, he understood from the classical point of view. And it was great because I was playing with the top musicians in the field. And the record ended up being a big success. It won a Grammy, classical Grammy, Russell Grammy, and selling a lot of records. And I'm glad I did it. It was a lot of work. We do a lot less work now.
As a horn player in the room, I'm sad to hear that it didn't work out. But I'm wondering, since you've developed so many new techniques for banjo, do you teach, do you help others to also?
It says Blue Ridge Banjo Academy. It's a school that, I guess you'd call it a camp that we just started 2 years ago. Finally, after many, many years. I used to teach a lot in the beginning, and then I just got so busy. And when I got home, if I was only home for 3 days, then I needed to have that time to write music or work on things or do my laundry or, you know, and so I tried to price myself out of teaching, but people would still come, and then I would feel bad, so I would charge just $100 per lesson, but instead of it being an hour, I would spend the whole day with them because I felt so bad about charging them so much. And so eventually I just stopped taking students, and then years and years and years and decades went by, and I started feeling bad about that. And so just recently someone came to me, there's a place called Brevard Music Center in North Carolina. There's a classical music school. Pete Lockhart is a big part of it over at from Boston Pops. And they, it's right in the Blue Ridge in North Carolina, near Asheville. And they asked me if I'd like to do a banjo camp there, and so that I just started doing that, and it's been a lot of fun. And there's a lot of great banjo players now. There's a lot more people that can do these things than there were when I started. Allison being a good example of somebody came in pretty early after me, but Noam McKelney, who plays with the Punch Brothers, and there's just a whole pile of really great folks that can carry this stuff forward. And part of the thinking with writing a concerto was the fact that I like to interact with musicians from all different parts of the musical world, but I couldn't do anything with classical musicians because they couldn't improvise. So I wanted to create some repertoire so banjo players could play with classical musicians. So I wrote some pieces for banjo and string quartet, and then these pieces. And hopefully there'll be a lot more people will write, and it'll become a cool thing. And I can leave it behind. When I get tired of playing, someone else can do it. Right now, I'm the only one who plays the pieces. Yeah.
Backing up to Africa, but that it came from Africa, banjo. How does African music sound on banjo?
It's great. I mean, it's a more primitive. I guess we'd call it more primitive. The instruments are not made to live hundreds of years like great violins and a lot of the instruments we play in the modern world. But it's a gourd. The strings are gut or fishing wire. It has a funky, plunky sound. They're great virtuosos. There's no frets. There's a lot of different styles. There's a guy named Baseko Kuyate, who's he calls himself the Bela Fleck of Mali. I might be the Baseko Kuyate of the United States, but he's just a genius musician who does, you just can't imagine all the music he gets out of this tiny little instrument. It's only this big, but it's a structure of the banjo. And Pete Seeger told me years ago that the banjo actually didn't come from Africa. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, where do you think it came from before Africa? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, it came from Mesopotamia, down the Tigris-Euphrates River, into through the trade routes into Africa from the Middle East. And at that time we were at war with Iraq. I was like, are you telling me that America's instrument is from Iraq? Pretty much. Yeah.
What performance meant the most to you?
What performance meant the most to me?
Yeah, most treasurable.
Do I have to pick one? There's been a lot of highlights, a lot of great experiences. So, I mean, I play a lot with Chick Corea now. That was a mind blower when we started playing duet concerts, but that's a big one. performing with Dave Matthews Band and stadiums has been pretty wild. But I like just a lot of interaction with a lot of different kinds of musicians, and there's a lot of great experiences. They're not all in huge places with big name people. Can be very personal sometimes in a smaller room, or even a house concert sometimes. It's more of a lifestyle, and I'm not trying to put a pin in a particular thing, just trying to keep on writing it. Yeah.
What's your nationality?
Okay, so Bela, I was named after, my father named me after classical composers, and he's German, of a German background. My mother's side was Russian, or Russian Jews, and but my father and my mother split up when I was about one or two, and so he had named both me and my brother. He named me after Bela Bartok and Leos Janáček and Anton Webern. And then he flew the coop. So I never met him until I was in my 40s. So it was kind of, you ever heard of that song, A Boy Named Sue? Teach her how to fight. Yeah, I named him Sue. So it was kind of like that. But then I ended up getting all this classical influence from my stepfather, just coincidentally. Yes. Is there anybody who's going to wait for a question? Yeah.
Forgive me, because this is perhaps in your bio, but you mentioned Edgar Meyer and Joey Ma. Were you involved in the Silk Road project?
The Silk Road.
Silk Road.
No, I'm very good friends with a lot of those guys. But in fact, some of the musicians are in the Silk Road project are in a string quartet called Brooklyn Rider. And Brooklyn Rider and I have collaborated a lot, toured a lot as a group. My wife actually recorded with Yo-Yo and the Silk Road Ensemble, because she speaks fluent Chinese and sings in Chinese and plays the banjo. So that's out there. Abigail Washburn.
You're mentioning a lot of our good friends.
Good.
Yeah.
You have good friends. Some great musicians. Yeah.
Well, so why don't you talk a little bit about the piece on Bethel here on Saturday?
Okay. Okay, so this is called the Juno Concerto, named it after my son Juno. Let's see. I think partly because the whole world changes when you have a child, and there's sort of before and after. Like here, when you hear Earl Scruggs, if you're going to be a banjo player. When you have a child, everything's different. So I was looking for ways to not travel, not be away, because I've lived a lifestyle where I've always traveled and played. You know, like I said, 250 days a year was not unusual for 25 years or so. But I didn't want, I'd also seen the havoc that can wreak on family, with some of my friends. And so when Abigail and Abby's a banjo player, and she plays the whole time clawhammer style. She sings really well. And we got together, but we were very different kinds of banjo players. And we never even thought about performing together, not even at parties we wouldn't play together. But one day we were at her Christmas celebration with her family, and her grandmother, who's the statesman of the family, said, "Bela and Abby are going to play for us now, come on." And we were like, "Well, we don't know how to play anything together." She said, no, come on. You're both musicians, play. So we got our instruments and we did a couple of songs, and it went pretty good. And we were like, wow, we're pretty good together. And the next thing you knew, she said, maybe a year later, she said, "I booked a show for you two at my church, my Unitarian church in United States, in Illinois." So we're like, well, when Grandma says you're doing something, I guess you're doing something. So we did it, and we didn't put a lot of thought into it. But the day before, we're like, what are we going to do? So we got together and we put together a real easy set list of stuff we thought we could get through together, and we did the show. And to our surprise, it really worked. And not only was the music good, but we were fun on stage. We were like a couple on stage. We joked around a lot, and the audience laughed a lot. And after we finished the show, I was like, "Honey, we should do this. There's sometime we should actually go out and tour and do this duo thing." And she said, "Well, I don't think it's a good idea, because like everybody in the banjo world, people really know me because I've been doing this for so long." And she was newer to that world, and she said, "They're just going to think I'm playing with you because I'm your girlfriend." And I said, "Well, as soon as they hear you, they'll know why we're playing together." And but anyway, so she said, "Well, let me go out there and make my own name for a while." And so years went by, 10 years or something. And now we were having a baby, and I said, honey, this is it. This is the chance. We should go do it. She said, okay, you're right. So after we had Juno, we started performing as a duo. And the idea is, how are we not going to just be apart through this whole child process? And one of the things that had happened is I had written the first banjo concerto, and I enjoyed the experience a lot. It was a little bit soon to be writing another one, but someone had come to me and asked me to commission a second banjo concerto. And someone who really liked the first one when we performed it, one of the orchestras. And I thought, well, this is a way I can have something cooking that's very complex and musically challenging in a way that playing with Abby actually is. It's just a more earthy kind of a thing. It's not scratching that itch or taking care of that part of me that wants to push into the unknown. I can quietly be working with this with my headphones and my Sibelius program while being on tour with Abby, while being home in the middle of the night when someone's got to watch the baby, and things like that. Because we were just such scared parents that we had this talking to before we left the hospital about SIDS, infant death syndrome. And we were like, what's not happening to our baby? We're going to watch him like nonstop at 6 months of his life. So we take turns through the night watching him. And so that was the perfect time. I could be watching him with my computer and like writing a concerto, where he'd wake up and that sort of thing. Finally get him back to sleep, and I would put in an hour on the concerto. So it fit into having this new phase of life of being parents and finding a way not to be apart. And then the other nice thing about it is when you go out and play a concerto, you go out for 3 or 4 days, you play, and you rehearse, you play, you come home. It's not like putting a band together and the band has to work. They all need the money and they all need the work, and you've got to plan for a year of serious touring to support an album. So it just made a lot of sense on a personal level, and also it was continued to be a musical stretch. And I also thought after the first Imposter, I played the piece with about 50 times, and it was getting pretty normal for me to be around an orchestra, and I thought I would probably write better. I'd be a little bit more thoughtful about how the instruments worked and what was a waste of time, what wasn't worth the effort, in orchestrations, and what was. So for all those reasons, yeah. As far as the piece itself, it starts out with this sort of fanfare, which I wrote on the piano. I recently found a voice memo where I wrote that, and it doesn't sound at all like Aaron Copland to me. But by the time I had put it on the instruments and orchestrated it, and we performed it the first time, and then the second time we performed it, we were recording it. It was at the rehearsal for the second performance, and we had all this recording going on. Then my classical manager guy came and he said, that sounds a lot like fanfare for the common man. And I was like, uh-oh. Because it was too late to change the piece. So, but I went in and did some reorchestrating and put in some color notes and tried to cover it up. But the truth is, it starts out with some of the language from that piece. It's not an actual lift, I don't think, but there's something very close to that piece. It's the kind of language that Copland used in that piece. But then it goes off. So and he said, I think you should just own it, and say it's a tribute to Aaron Copland. I said, but Copland is not one of my formative people. I never really, but somehow that happened. That's the whole process. I wish he had told me a month ahead, I would have changed it. But the truth is, so much the piece was built on this opening theme being expanded and done in all these different ways that it would have been very hard to rewrite it. It's just a theme. If you hear that at the show, it sounds kind of like, just hang in there. It's going to keep going. Yeah.
I guess it might be more of a question for Grant, actually. You talked about learning about writing for orchestra and doing that practical, so that way it the short rehearsal time is manageable. So I'm just curious, since Grant also chose to go speak to that just being a normal part of the process, for people who have all of the classes background.
Yeah, I mean, we did the first concerto a couple years back, and I can say it's a much more practical piece in some ways, certainly than the the second one, yeah. Sort of easier to learn. I don't know if the orchestra feels it that way, but I think it's, the first one feels like it goes to it's kind of a million different places a little bit, and that's tricky, I think, for orchestras, just kind of conceptually to keep making those shifts over and over again, and especially when there's so much kind of rhythmic complexity in the way that he writes. So this one feels sort of smoother, it kind of stays in the same place for longer periods of time, and things like that. And I think that definitely lowers our stress level when we're learning it. You know, there's even simple thing, the contrabassoon part's much easier in the second concerto than the first one. Things like that also come through. And again, I don't know if the orchestra would agree with this, but even the rhythmic difficulty of it, there's tons of quintuplets, which are famously, you know, classical musicians look at those and frown, things like that. But even that part of it, it's somehow within a framework that comes more easily together. You know, those gigantic 5/8 sections in the first concerto, for instance, can cause stress in a way that the quintuplets in the second concerto don't quite. And I mean, even, you know, you talk about this non-Coplandy fanfare that opens the piece. The fact that that comes back and that the relationships are really obvious, I think. I mean, we talked about how some of them aren't, but many of them are. And I think just, again, sort of that kind of fits the expectations of the orchestra. They're used to playing music that does those sorts of things. And I think that's the part that makes, you know, note for note, is it easier? Maybe, maybe not, but conceptually it's definitely an easier piece, I'd say.
Yeah, and when I first do with the quintuplets, usually I'm playing them for a long time, and everyone's hearing them played. So by the time they get them, it's kind of planned that way. By the time they have to play them, they've been hearing me do them for quite a while. So because a quintuplet is actually what it sounds like. It sounds like this complicated thing, but it's not. It doesn't have to be that hard. But instead of a triplet, which would be two groups of three, you do five notes. Now on the banjo, it's a roll. It's a 5-note roll. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's very easy actually on the banjo. In other ways. But anyway, by the time they have to play them, they've heard me do them for a while, kind of in a flowing, fairly natural way. So it's not quite the shock that you have to play them out of nowhere, like the part in the first concerto where there was a lot of 5/4 out of nowhere, and 5/8, and very fast. And when I played that piece, I actually liked that part, but it wasn't practical. It was once you've learned it and everyone's playing it good, it sounds really nice, but it was a lot harder to get. So, you know, unfortunately, you have to think about that stuff. The composer is thinking about not just writing whatever they want to write, but what can actually be played, and that's part of the job, I think. And then there's idealistic composers who can write stuff that is really, really, really hard to play, but it's rare that they're going to hear it played the way they imagine it, and so that can be frustrating, you know. But there's an impression that an orchestra can play anything you write, or the classical musician can play anything you write. That's not true. There's nothing. I mean, there's things that are too hard for any instrument, especially, you know, the thing you don't think about is you're doing it within a certain very limited time. And a lot of orchestra players don't always practice outside of they don't always prepare. Because generally a lot of the music is
Shocked.
A lot of the music is stuff they're going to be able to sight read. It's just not necessary. And then all of a sudden they show up and they've got quintuplets going through a lot of keys. You got to get to work. So a lot of times after the first rehearsal, people will come back really well prepared. So see what it is. It's not that hard. My stuff's not that hard. Not next to what's not there. The thing is, they haven't heard it before. Some of the great, really awesome classical writing, people have been playing their whole lives, so it's not challenging. They already know inside and out the difficulties of those pieces. But when someone writes a new piece, nobody knows it yet. So when they're first sight reading and learning it, it's like, I don't know, I just don't know about this. But by the end of the performance, a lot of times they're starting to really get what the piece is. So that's the thing every new piece has against it. Nobody's heard it before. people haven't had years to figure out how to play the thing, like with the, great Brahms piece or Mozart, Debussy, or Ravel, or Stravinsky.
Well, we have another engagement pretty soon here. Maybe one more question?
I have one. Have you ever played in a banjo festival where you just wing it out, everybody, a large group of banjos, and just had fun with it?
I'm sorry, have I ever played a banjo festival?
Well, festival, like the whole group of banjos. And it seemed like that'd be interesting.
You mean like an
solo.
orchestra, like a big, huge group of banjos? Is that what you mean? Yeah, well, at my camp, we have 100 students, and we work up some pieces with all 100 and put it on a big stage for the closing concert. But I do have a secret plan, which I'm working on right now for the next couple of years, which is to assemble an old-fashioned banjo orchestra and take it on the road. It's a very expensive idea because mostly does it take a lot of rehearsal because most banjo players aren't used to playing in these kinds of groups. So that has to be part of the whole plan, but there's a lot of interest in it, actually. And it could be, it doesn't have to be 90 banjo players. It can be a chamber orchestra. That's the smallest thing we can call it. Because back in the old days, banjo orchestras might be 20 people, 17 people.
That would count.
That would count? Okay, good. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, everyone. See you Saturday night.